Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Tech Tuesday. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk and today's topic is from concept to manufacture, and this is actually another personal project of mine where I created or I made this cutting board on my table saw, but then I wanted to create this groove for basically for like if you're cutting meat or something like that, you want the juices to kind of get trapped inside of this groove. So I'm going to show how I went about creating this in Fusion, and then we're going to take it from our concept to manufacturing. So I'll show you how I went about creating this groove and on my CNC machine and actually cut it. The bad news is I actually gave this cutting board to my in-laws and they're on a business trip right now, so I can't show you the actual finished cutting board, but maybe on a future live stream I can show it to you guys. So let's dive right in. We're going to cover a lot of topics on this. I'm going to show some neat tips and tricks. Again, on the chat is my buddy Aaron. He's going to be answering questions and all kind of stuff. And let's kind of start by just creating a new design. And I'm going to make sure, in this case, my units are in inches. Now, what's cool with this cutting board, without going into too much detail, I have a special table saw jig, basically. It's called an Incra jig. It increments every 30 seconds of an inch. It's extremely accurate, and this cutting board is actually from their webpage. They show how to manufacture, how to make this cutting board. And so each of those strips is basically a 30 seconds of an inch wider. And so you basically just cut a 1/32, a 2/32, a 3/32, etc. From different materials, and then you glue them together. So we're going to kind of simulate that inside of Fusion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by creating a sketch, and I'm going to start with this front view. And I know that the overall thickness that I want this board to be is about 1 inch. So I'm going to just draw a line that's exactly 1 inch tall. And then we're going to use the pattern command, a rectangular pattern. What this allows us to do is to select our object, and then I'm going to start to drag to the right, and you'll see that it's going to pattern this line. Now we have a couple different options. You'll notice here it says distance type is spacing or extent. So instead of saying I want it every 1 inch, I could say I want this to be 20 inches wide, for example. But in this case, we're going to leave it at spacing. Then we also have the ability to increase the quantity. So you can see as I increase this up to 6, we now have 6 lines. Okay. Then it's asking for the distance, and this is the distance in between these lines. So you can kind of see as I drag this down, we're at about 1/2 inch. And if we drag it farther to the right, we're closer to 1 inch. Now, what I want to do is we're going to actually use a little bit of math here. I want the overall width to be 22 inches in width. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and say I want the distance to be 22 times 1/32, which is actually 0.03125. So this is 1/32 of an inch right here. And so what I'm basically doing is I'm specifying what I want this distance to be, and this will make more sense as we get a little bit further along. I also want the quantity to be 22. And so it's going to create 22 lines at this particular spacing. I'll go ahead and say OK. And we've now created a pattern that's spaced. And in fact, if I throw a dimension on here really quick, we'll see what that dimension is. So it's 0.6875. So I know that my widest section is going to be 0.6875. Okay. And again, this will make more sense as we go a little bit further along. Now, the next thing I want to do is to create those 1/32, 2/32, 3/32 offsets. And this is a pretty cool trick. So check this out. I'm going to come in here. I'll say rectangular pattern. I'll pick the first line again. Okay. And I'm just going to start to drag to the right. Now, what I want to do here is, again, I want 22 of these. But I want the spacing to be that exact same formula. So I'm going to say 22 times 0.03125. Okay. Now you can see that it's putting those right on top of the other ones. But I'm going to go ahead and add another 30 seconds of an inch. So 0.03125. And we can see how it's now gradually getting wider and wider and wider. And as we go along here, we can kind of see what that's going to look like. Okay. Now, let me go ahead and change this formula again really quick. I'm going to, let's try this really. I'm going to do another, whoops. Let's go plus. I'm putting this in parentheses to see if that will, so I'm actually not getting the exact result that I want. So give me a second here. I'm going to do that formula one more time. So let me do this dimension. Of course, this worked when I practiced. Now I'm not getting the result that I want. So 0.6875. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. Okay. And then I'll create my pattern again. So let's try this one more time. So I want my distance. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. And then I'm going to add my 30 seconds of an inch. So 0.03125. And I want to do 22. There we go. So this is what I was looking for, where we can kind of see the spacing gets gradually larger, and then it gets gradually smaller again. Okay, so again, in practice it worked fine. When I'm doing it live, I must have typed something in incorrectly. So what I basically just did is I took that distance that we knew from these first two, and then I'm just adding a 30 seconds of an inch each time. We can kind of see what that looks like. I'll say okay, and now I can come in. And I'm just going to create a rectangle. I basically want to turn this into a profile. So I'm going to create a rectangle that goes from the very start to the very end over here. Okay. And let's go ahead and finish our sketch. So we used some formulas to basically create these blocks. And I've actually created both colors, both the walnut and the maple right now. So I'm going to start with one of these. I'm just going to go ahead and grab these larger ones. And you can kind of see we're basically selecting every other one. And it's going to get smaller and smaller as we go along. So I'm probably going to have to zoom up here a little bit. So I'm going to grab each of these profiles. And this last one here also. Okay. Then I'll right mouse click and say extrude. And as I start to drag, we can kind of visually see what the result here is going to be. Now, I want this to be 24 inches long, so I'm going to just type in 24, and we can see that it's going to extrude 24 inches. Now, to keep things organized, instead of new body, I'm going to say new component. And what this is going to happen is because none of these bodies are intersecting with each other, it's going to create a component and put all of those bodies inside of it. In fact, watch what happens when I say OK. We now have this component right here. And I can rename this. I can call it walnut. If we expand this guy open, we'll see that underneath it, it has all of the different bodies. So that's a great way to kind of quickly organize things. So if I just said leave it as bodies, it would have created a bodies folder. I would have had to create a component. I would have had to drag the bodies into that component. So the easy way is in the extrude, instead of saying new body, you'll say new component. Now I like to add appearances instead of this gray. So I'm going to hit A for appearance, and you'll notice it brings up our appearance dialog. Okay. So I can come in here and pick whichever material I want. So we can see that we have a bunch of different materials. We've got fabric and liquids and metals. If I scroll down at the bottom, there's wood, and you'll see wood solid. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and we have a couple different kinds. I'm going to say it's finished, and we can see we've got cherry and maple and walnut, etc. And I'm going to do this walnut glossy. I'm just going to drag this onto my component. Now you'll notice if I drag it onto my screen, it's only going to do one body at a time. But if I drag it onto the component, it's going to apply that material to all of the bodies inside that component all at once. So a neat little tip right there. If you have a lot of the same object, you can just drag it to the component. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn our sketch back on, and this time we'll start at the other end. And I'm just going to go ahead and grab these profiles, and if I want to, I could turn off the walnut to kind of get it out of the way. So I'm just going to basically select the opposing profiles. Again, kind of zoom up here and grab these last few profiles. Okay. I'll right mouse click and say extrude. Now here's another tip. I don't know if you know this or not, but under the distance, if you click the little down arrow, it actually remembers the previous things you've typed in. So I did 24 last, so I'm going to just click on 24, and you'll see that it goes ahead and extrudes that, the exact same distance. Now here's the catch. It thinks it wants to join all of those together, but we don't want to. We want to say new component, and you'll see it's going to extrude these all as a new component. And watch again what happens when we say OK. We get another component over here with all of the individual bodies. So you can kind of see, if I expand this guy open, all the different bodies here. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this. Let's just call this maple. I'll turn off the other one so we can see we just have the gray. I'll do my appearance again. And this time we're going to do the 3D maple glossy. I'm just going to drag that over there. Okay, now here's a neat little trick. I actually lucked out. I really like the 3D wood. You can kind of see how it simulates, actual wood. So you can kind of see the end grain, the cross grain, etc. And you'll see that there's a little bit of randomness to it. But you'll notice that these three right here, in fact, almost all of these kind of look the same. And I want to add a little bit more randomness to it. So this is kind of digressing slightly, but it's a neat little trick. I'm going to switch into my render workspace. I need to add some lights real quick. So let's do maybe some rim highlights or something like that. There we go. And I might also change I'll just do a viewport. Okay, so we can kind of see what this looks like. I'll crank up the light just a little bit so we can see what that looks like, a little bit more natural. I want to make these look a little bit more random. And to do that, you can come in here to your texture map controls. And what this allows you to do is you can pick on any of these, and you'll see that you can transform the texture map. So watch as I drag up, you're seeing this end grain actually going up or down. And so it's going to create a different look on this particular piece of wood. Now I need to do that on all of these. And here's the tip I wanted to tell you about. So I can see that I'm moving this in the Y direction, in the Y distance. So instead of just randomly dragging, I can actually type in random. And then I'm going to do a left parenthesis and a right parenthesis. Then you can add a multiplier. So I'm going to say times 2. So basically what it's doing is it's going to pick a random number from 0 to 1. So a pretty small number. So here I'm multiplying that result by 2. Okay? So then I'm going to copy this into my clipboard. So I just did a Control-C. And then I'll do the exact same thing on the rest of these. So I'm going to click on this guy, Y direction. I'm just going to paste that in there. And you'll see how that looks different than that guy. Okay? And I'll do the same thing. I'll repeat on this guy here. Y direction, I'll paste that in, and we can see how that looks a little bit different. And again, I could even, if I wanted to, I could say times 4 or something like that. I'm going to get a much different result. So it's basically picking a random number for each of these. Now, it is a little bit of work. I'm going to have to do these each individually, and I'll show you why here in just a second. And I'm not going to do all of these just for time constraints, but we can now see how we're adding some random looks to this. Okay. Now, if I were to repeat my texture map and select multiple ones, you'll notice it doesn't give me that option because, you know, we're basically moving multiple ones at the same time. And so all of these would move up at the same time. So that's why we end up doing it individually, where I just click on one and then I can come in and set my transform. So all you have to remember is to, you know, copy that into your clipboard and paste it, and it goes very, very quick. So a neat little tip there. Hopefully you find that useful. We'll go back to our design and we'll turn the walnut back on, and you'll see literally in just a few moments we created the basis of our cutting board. Notice our timeline is very, very simple. We spent a little bit of time in our sketch to create these perfect size blocks, and then we just were able to extrude them and change the materials. Okay. Okay, so now we want to start kind of finishing this. And I don't know if you saw in the preview image, in fact I'll bring this guy up here, you'll see that there's this strip that's going in the opposite direction. And because of how accurate that table saw fence is, you basically make this board like so, and then you cut that strip out, flip it around, and glue it back in. So we're going to simulate that in this case here also. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a sketch on one of these faces. Let's just rotate. I kind of like to look at it from the side. And I'm just going to draw a rectangle. I don't care what size it is right now. I'm just going to kind of get it on the screen like so. Now I'm going to come in and let's make this, so that looks about 2.5. That's a little bit too wide. Let's see what 2 inches looks like. That looks a little bit better. And I want to specify maybe the distance from the end here. Let's try 2.5. Let's just see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. So I just created a quick rectangle, and we're going to use this to split. So I'm going to say split body. Okay. What's the body to split? Well, I'm just going to draw a box around everything. Now, I'm going to do that again because I'm going to show you a neat little trick here. Okay. Typically, when you select, you drag from left to right. And this is what we call a window selection. But if I drag from right to left, you'll notice it looks a little bit different. And this is what we call a crossing selection. So instead of having to draw a big box around everything like so, I was able to just kind of draw a crossing, and it's going to select anything that was inside that window and anything that was crossing by that window. So I just grabbed all of those bodies. What's the splitting tool? This guy here. And I'll say OK. And it didn't do it, did it? Interesting. Let's try that again. Why did that not? Oh, I guess it didn't do it. Oh, I know why. Huh. Guess what? Here's why. Because my display settings, I turned off my visible edges. So I'm going to turn this back on, and there we go. So I make mistakes. I was like, that should have worked. Okay, so for the presentation, I actually turned off my visible edges, and that's why I didn't show up. So everything worked correctly, but that one kind of burned me there for a little bit. So anyways, it did split. We can see these individual bodies now, okay? So all I want to do now is just rotate those around. So I'm going to say move. We'll leave it set to bodies. And again, I'm just going to kind of do a crossing window. I'm just going to select these guys right there like so. Okay. And I'm just going to rotate this 180 degrees. So I'm going to start to drag, and we can see we take that whole section and make sure I snap to 180 degrees. If I was off slightly, I could come in and type in 180 if I wanted to. And then I'm going to kind of move this out of the way, like so. Now I want to put this back, and I did what's called a free move. So I just grabbed some of these little triads and I rotated them and I moved them on a plane, but I want to be more precise. Well, I can go from point to point. So I'm going to say, let's go from this point right here. Now it's asking for a target point. We'll go to this point right here, and you'll see that it's going to move those exactly from one point to another. I think this is an underused command. Honestly, everybody kind of does the free move and stuff, but I use point to point quite a bit because I want to go from one point to a specific other point. And I'll say okay, and we just created that cool little accent, if you want to call it that, in our block. Okay. So I just glanced over at the chat, and somebody said, can you change your pivot point? Absolutely. Let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to come in here and say move. I'll do the exact same thing. I'll just kind of draw a box around these guys. If I did the free move, you'll notice it just kind of randomly put this triad out in space somewhere. There's this icon right here that says set pivot. So I could click on set pivot, and then I can grab, for example, an edge. It doesn't matter where. I can grab this edge here. I could grab a face, a point on a face. So you can see I have a lot of options here. So I could actually grab, for example, that edge. Now, when I'm done, I need to come back and click on this little checkbox saying I'm done setting my pivot. Then I can go ahead and rotate that around, and you'll see that it's actually going to pivot on that edge. Now that's using the free move. I ended up using the 2 points, but yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. Okay, the next thing I want to do is to kind of round over some of these edges. Now you're going to notice we're going to run into an issue. So I'm going to create a fillet, but because these are individual bodies, you'll notice that it's only going to want to, let's just do 0.25, it's only going to want to fillet this particular edge. And I've got a bunch of little tiny edges in here. I'd have to come in and select these all individually, and that would take quite some time. Okay? So again, we're going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to look at it from the side. And let's just draw a selection box around all of those edges. And notice it said there's 42 of them. So instead of manually clicking and potentially making a mistake or missing one of those edges, I just drew a selection box around it. And let's just make those 0.25. Okay, and you'll notice how it filleted all of those at the same time. Let's do the same thing. I'll say, let's look at it from the side. I'll add another selection. Just going to draw a box like so. It found 42 edges. We'll make those 0.25. And it did all of those on that backside also. Now all I have left to do is I can come in and add in a couple more edges. So I mean, I could do a selection box, but these are just 3 edges. So I'm just going to go ahead and manually select those. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Okay. Like so. And I'll say OK. Now, I accidentally made a mistake. I typically like to fillet these vertical edges first. Now, I could come in and fillet those, or I could drag my marker before these other fillets. So I'm basically going back in time and saying I want to do these vertical fillets first. So I'm going to go ahead and select those, and let's make those a little bit larger. Let's make those 1/2 inch in diameter, or I'm sorry, radius in this case. Here's another neat little trick. You can pick through and grab that other edge without even rotating. Okay. Hopefully you knew that one. So I'm going to go ahead and select those, say OK, and then I'm going to drag to the right. And it's going to update, but notice the result that I got. Okay. So I might come in here and edit this particular fillet. And I want to add in this round edge like so. And now I get a nice curve. So before, and this is what we call the rolling ball method. So if I scroll over here, we can kind of see it basically took this shape and just extruded it, or filleted off to the end, off to the end, off to the end. But I want a nice transition. So I'm just coming in here and I'm adding in those little blends right there, and we can see the nice result that we get. So even though I did the order incorrectly, I was able to come back and easily fix this. Instead of having to redo all of my selections, I'm able to come in and just say, hey, let's add in that new little fillet there, and I get the really nice looking result. Okay. Hopefully this is making sense. Actually, really quick, I've noticed on some of my other live streams, people were asking, how am I rotating and panning so smoothly? And I'm actually using one of these devices. This is called a 3D connection. I don't know if you can see the name there. It's a 3D mouse. And what this allows you to do is basically pan and zoom and rotate by kind of moving this little guy around. So if I go back to my screen here, you'll see as I'm rotating with this little space mouse or 3D connection mouse, it creates some really nice smooth movements. If you do a lot of CAD, they're about $99 on Amazon. You can get them on eBay, etc. They're called a 3D connection mouse. I highly recommend using them. They are so useful. It basically frees up my right hand just for the mouse and my left hand for the 3D rotating and zooming and panning. And I'm not having to use my shift middle mouse button or the view cube. So hopefully that answers the question. If people were on my other live streams or on this one wanting to know what I was using, it's called the 3D connection mouse. Okay, now what I want to do, I've got the board looking pretty good. I want to add in that little groove. And basically I'm going to use this as like a meat cutting board. So I want the juices from the turkey or the pot roast, whatever we've made, to be caught in that little groove. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just create a sketch on one of these top faces. And I'm just going to start with a basic rectangle. Now, here's something, again, that came up in a previous live stream. You'll notice as I'm moving around, it's trying to catch automatically to these edges. You can kind of see how they're highlighting blue. And in this case, I do not want to catch to these edges. So I'm going to control my selection. I'm going to hold down my control key on a PC, and you'll notice that it's no longer trying to snap to those edges. As soon as I let go of my control key, it's again trying to automatically snap to those edges. So I'm going to hold down control. I'm just going to basically draw a quick rectangle, something like so. Okay, and it didn't catch to any of those other edges. Then I'll come in and dimension this. So let's go from maybe this outside edge to that inside edge is just about an inch. So let's go ahead and say 1 inch. Let's go maybe from here to here. Now here's another tip. I want this to be the exact same distance. I could type in 1, or I can click on an existing dimension, and you'll see that it's going to reference that dimension. When I hit OK, we'll see that that updated, and this is now whatever that dimension is. So I'll show you a neat tip with this here in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and continue adding these around. I'm going to reference that dimension. And then finally, let's do this over here. And I'll reference that dimension. So this is basically a rectangle that's all 1 inch from the edge. And if I say, you know what, that's not quite what I want, I could come in here and say 1.5. You'll see that all of these dimensions updated to 1.5 because we referenced this one here. So a neat little trick. I use that a lot actually, where I'll just create one, and if there's equal ones, I'll just click on that existing dimension to reference it. I want to create a nice curve here, so let's go ahead and use our fillet command. I'll click on that corner. Obviously, that's a little bit too big, so let's do maybe 0.5 in this case. I'll just go ahead and grab these other corners real quick, and they are all now 0.5 fillet corners. And we're done. I'm going to finish my sketch. So basically we just kind of drew this shape on the top. Now I want to remove some material to go along this profile. And to do that, we're going to use the sweep command. We're going to sweep a profile along a path. So we just created the path. Now we need to create the profile. So I think the easiest way of doing this is to actually use a construction plane along a path. I want to put my planes somewhere on this path, and you'll notice that this path doesn't exist on this front face or the side face or from the origin or anything like that, so I can't really reference these front faces. I need to reference this path. So I'm going to go ahead and select on it. And what this allows you to do is to put this plane anywhere you want along this path. And you can see I'm dragging it along, and it's going to rotate around the fillets and then go down the straight edge there. You can also see this distance. And this is a ratio from 0 to 1. So for example, if I say 0, it's going to go to the very start. If I say 0.5, it's going to go halfway along this path. If I say 0.75, it's going to go, oh, it's 0.75, 3/4 of the way along the path. So it's basically 0 to 1. Now in this case, I'm going to just say 0. And we now have a piece of paper that's exactly at the start point of this path. And we can now sketch on this. So let's go ahead and say create a sketch. It goes orthographic. I'm going to rotate so you can kind of see what's going on here. There's my 0, 0 point right there at on the path. Here's my path, and there's that 0, 0. So let's go ahead and draw a circle. We're going to catch to that point, and I want this to be 0.25 in diameter. Okay. So we can see that we created that circle on that path. I'm going to just say finish sketch. And now we can do the sweep command. So if I come in here and say sweep, It's going to ask, what's the profile? I'm going to zoom out here just a little bit. So this is the profile. What's the path? I'm just going to click on that edge right there. And we can see an instant preview of what this is going to look like. I'm going to zoom out so we can see that groove going all the way around. Obviously, we want to cut. So I'm going to say OK. And it's going to cut that groove all the way along that path. Now you can kind of see why I added the fillet in the sketch, because I wanted to go around the corner instead of a sharp edge. And what I like about this is I can say, you know, that groove's not quite big enough. So let's go back to our sketch. And let's edit this dimension here. So instead of 0.25, let's try 0.5. Finish our sketch. And it's going to cut that groove again using that larger dimension. So we can kind of see that looks a little bit better. Okay, now here's an issue. As I'm looking at this, there's a sharp edge along here, okay, on both sides. Now I want to fillet this. And earlier I showed how easy it was to basically just use selection windows and, you know, just draw a box around and grab the edges that you want. Now things are getting a little bit more complicated. There's more surfaces, etc. So instead of using the fillet command, I might actually change my profile to include some pseudo fillets. So let's go ahead and edit this profile again. Okay, so we're kind of taking a look at it. I'll go ahead and turn on this other sketch so we kind of see the plane that it's on. And so I actually want to create a little bit of a fillet on both sides here. Now this is kind of weird. I'm not saying this is the best way of doing this, but I'm just showing you have a couple options here. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to draw a line. Okay, out here in space. Let me just look at it kind of from the side here. I'm just going to draw a line, and I don't care what length it is right now. Actually, well, let's say that's 0.5. Let's just make this 0.6 in length. And then I'm going to grab the midpoint of that line to that point right there. And you can see that it moved that line equally down to that point. Okay. Then what I might do is come in and create, let's just do an arc. I'm going to do a 3-point arc. And I just have to get near this edge right here. And I'll get near that point. And then it's kind of hard to see, but it's actually going to snap tangent automatically as I move to the left. You'll notice there's no icon on this little dot right here. But as soon as I move to the left, you'll see that little icon, and it automatically created a tangency for me. Now I also want to make sure that this is tangent to the circle, so I'll come in here and say tangent, that arc, and that circle, and I've now confirmed that that 3-point arc is tangent over there, and I'll do the exact same thing over here. I'm just going to do an arc, 3-point arc, just get near, get the tangent, and then I'll come in again, and tangent and tangent. We can kind of see how the arc extended a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is basically just finish my profile. So I'm just going to draw a basic rectangle up like so. Okay. I know this might not make much sense what I'm doing right now, but basically what I've done is I've now created a profile. I'm actually going to trim that circle out of there. And let's trim that guy and that guy out of there. Okay, so you can see we've created this profile that we're going to use to sweep along. Now you'll notice when I exit out of my sketch, nothing has updated, but that's because in my sweep, I only told it one profile. So we're going to edit our sweep feature, and now I can come in and add in that profile, and notice what it's doing now. It's taking that little curve and sweeping it along on both sides. I'll say OK. And we now have this nice looking fillet on both edges that go all the way around. Now I know that was kind of like, well, couldn't you have just used the fillet command? Absolutely. Absolutely you could. I wanted to show this way because it takes kind of a simple profile and just adds a little bit more to it and creates a pretty cool organic type of a sweep where we've got our groove and our fillets all in one sweep. The other thing I'm going to show here is you'll notice as I'm zooming up, I'm getting some neat reflections and stuff like that, but you see like these little pits and holes and stuff like that. That's actually part of the appearance. So I'm going to come back into my appearance, and if we edit this walnut, you'll see that there's an option in here called pores and rays. And if I turn off pores, you'll see that those go away. And then it might be kind of hard to see, but you'll see some rays in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and you'll see how those went away. So it's just adding or removing a little bit of realism into how you want your representation to be. So you can kind of see all of these little indents. If we turn off pores, those go away. Okay, so again, it's up to you. I'll go ahead and leave rays on, but I'm going to turn off pores on both of these because I don't want those to be represented. Okay. So now I'm pretty much done with my design. So that's looking really nice. I've got my juice groove that goes all the way around. Everything looks good. Now I want to manufacture this. And again, going back to the real world of how this was made, I cut all of these strips on my table saw, and then I glued them together, sanded them, etc. Then I cut this section out, flipped it around, glued it together, and I was left with the nice flat board. Okay, I was left with this representation. But then I wanted to create that groove, that juice groove that goes all the way around. And so I decided to use my CNC machine to do this. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to take this into the manufacture workspace and create that groove. And I'll show you how I set it up, etc. on my machine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's just call this meat board. Okay. And then we're going to switch into the manufacture workspace. And this is where we can specify how this thing's going to get manufactured. We can do cam, we can do laser, water jet, etc. Obviously in this case we're going to do cam. And it's again left to right. So the very first thing I want to do is to create a setup. And what this is going to allow me to do is to tell where is my 0, 0 point? Where is my Z direction for my CNC machine? Now, here's the setup menu, and we're gonna dive deeper into cam in upcoming live streams. So this is gonna be a fairly high level overview, but it's basically broken into 3 tabs: our setup, our stock, and our post-process. And I'm actually gonna jump over into our stock tab. And you'll see we have many different options. We can say we want it to be a fixed size box, a relative size, etc. Okay, even from solid. Now, unfortunately, I can't use from solid because it's only going to allow me to pick one solid, for example. I want to be able to do all of them. So I'm going to do a relative size box. And you can see that it's actually adding, in fact, I'll kind of look at it from the side. It's adding a little bit of extra material, the 0.04 on the sides and on the top. Well, in my case, I'm going to zero right off the top. So I don't want any extra stock, so I'm going to say 0, and we can see how that moves down. And I also don't want any stock on the side in this case, so I'm going to say 0 there. And we can see that our overall size is about 15 by 24 in this case. Okay? And the height is 1. So I'm going to go ahead and add 0 all the way around. And then you can see that we have the option to specify where is our 0, 0, or our work coordinate system. Now, I usually come off the front left corner, but you'll notice that this is rounded off. So I really don't have anything to, touch off of or anything like that. So what I ended up doing was just throwing a piece of masking tape on my cutting board and measuring diagonal. And it created a little X, and that was basically my center point. So this is what I'm going to select as my stock point, is this center of this board. And I'll say OK. So we basically just told the machine how big is the object and where is 0, 0, 0 of the work coordinate system. Okay, I just glanced over at the chat window. Everybody's a comedian. Somebody said, "What? No hand planers, no chisels." I admit I used a CNC machine and I used power sanders and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. So okay. So I've done my setup. Now what I want to do is we're going to create that groove. And in this case, the easiest solution is to use what's called a 2D contour. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these different options here, but basically contour allows you to follow a path. So I'm going to say 2D contour. And again, it's left to right. So we have lots of tabs in here. The tool tab, we've got, we can do the geometry tab, the heights tab, passes, linking, etc. But we're going to start in the tool tab, and we can select a tool. I like to come in here and specify what type of tool, and you can see all of the different options. Well, in this case, I used a ball end mill, so I'm going to say ball end mill. And I'm going to just use my sample here. It shows all of the different ball end mills that I have. Okay. Now in this case, I want to use a 1/2 inch ball end mill. I'll say OK. And we've just specified the tool. In fact, it even shows a graphical representation of it, the holder and everything, which is kind of cool. The next thing I want to select is the geometry. Now, here's something kind of interesting. I could come in and select all of these little profiles, but you'll notice that that's going to take a huge amount of time, a huge amount of editing. So instead, I'm going to use the sketch that was used to create that particular sweep. So I can come in here and open up my sketches, and let's just turn on sketch number 3. And it's going to be kind of hard to see, but there's that profile. So I can actually use a sketch. And you'll notice when I click on it, it highlights it. Now, I'm emphasizing this because I think this is extremely useful. A lot of people think in the manufacturer workspace you have to physically machine what's on the part, that groove, and I might have to come back with a ball end mill and go back and forth. But you can actually use sketches and sketch geometry to define boundaries, to define toolpaths and everything. And again, we're going to dive deeper into this in upcoming live streams, but you're going to see the power of this. So I selected that sweep profile. And then I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. And I'll show you what I'm doing here. I told it what tool and I told it what geometry. I'm going to say OK. And it's going to calculate that toolpath. And then I come in and I usually preview it. So if I right mouse click on it, you can come in and simulate. Okay. And what this allows you to do is to simulate how is this going to cut. So for example, I could turn off transparent. You can kind of see what's going on here. Let's go ahead and hit play and watch what happens. And I already see an issue. It's not actually cutting the material. It's running right along the top of the material. Okay, so that makes no sense. Well, the reason for that is because I didn't go into my Heights tab, which is the next tab. So all I did was specify my tool and my geometry. And I typically do this, I stop there, I just do a quick simulation to make sure everything looks okay. Now I'm going to come into my Heights tab, and you'll notice that the bottom height is 0 inches from the selected contour. And we have a lot of options in here. Again, not going to go through all of these, but basically now it makes sense, right? It was going along that contour at a height of 0 inches. So if I wanted to go down 1/4 of an inch, I could say go from the selected contour, but go down 1/4 of an inch. I'll say okay. It's going to quickly recalculate that toolpath. When I come in here and do my simulate now, I'll hit play. Now we can see that it's actually plunging into the geometry. I can turn it transparent if I want to. We can kind of see what that looks like. But now I see another issue, okay? Actually, a couple issues. First of all, it doesn't look like it actually cut down the middle of the groove. It actually looked like it cut over a little bit. So I need to figure that out. And then the other thing I can see, and I love this about the preview, I can see that it looks like it must be ramping in a little bit. And I can actually come in here and drag, and sure enough, I'm just kind of, so I'm holding down my left mouse button. I can simulate what this is going to look like. So we can see that it's going to plunge down over here and then move into the path and start to move. So unfortunately, that would create a big, huge chunk out of my beautiful cutting board, and that would make me not happy. Okay, so that's why the simulate is so awesome. So what we're going to do is go back and edit this tool, and coming into passes, you'll see that we have the option to specify, is it climb or conventional milling? Okay, well in this case I'm going to leave it climb. And then right here it says compensation type. Now what this allows you to do is to actually have the software figure out like wear and tear on your cutter, and it will compensate for that. But in this case, I'm going to turn this to be off. And this is what's going to allow it to follow right down the center of the toolpath now. So now we can see the toolpath is lined up with that, but I still have the issue of the ramping going on. So one last time, I'll come in and edit this and go to the very last tab, which is the linking tab. Okay, and you'll see, sure enough, right here is leads and transitions, and it has lead in entry. I don't want it to do any kind of a lead in or a lead out, so I'm going to turn those off. However, I do want to gradually ramp into my design. What that means is instead of plunging straight down, which puts a whole bunch of torque on my machine, it's going to gradually ramp down. In fact, I can specify what's the ramping angle. I can specify the maximum ramp step, etc., etc. You can see all of the options here. So I'm going to say, let's just come in at 2 degrees. And I'll say, okay. So the key thing here is we turned on our lead in and our lead out. I'll say, okay. And now, it's going to be a little harder to see. Let me kind of zoom up here. You can see this little red line. It's going to start to ramp down as it's going around the corner even. And then it gets to a point at the correct depth and it's going to go all the way around. So let's simulate what that looks like. In fact, I'll rotate kind of this direction so we can kind of see. So I'll come in and say simulate. I'll hit play, and you'll see it kind of gradually go down, and then it's cutting the full depth. So I love this. You can kind of see the slight ramp right there, and it's going to come all the way around and go back over until it comes over here again to match that depth. And there we go. Okay. So it gradually went in, so it's not putting all that force and effort onto my CNC machine. We can verify that sure enough it's going down our groove. We can kind of see that by these parts here. If I turn off, you'll see how that goes away. So I've now verified that this is exactly what I need to do. So all I have left to do now is to post-process. Okay. Now I use Mach 3 for my post-processor, which you can see by default is right here. We've got a whole bunch of different ones in here like Okuma, Haas, Shopbot, etc. But I use Mach 3. I can give it a program name, I can give it a comment or whatever. I have all my options in here. Like, do I use a G28 safe retract? I'm going to say no in this case. Okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and post this. We'll say okay. And literally, in a matter of moments, I get back the G code that I can now take out to my CNC machine. So there's my name and my note, and there's the contour, and there's all the G code for creating that contour. So I would then set up my cutting board at on my CNC machine, find 000, put in my 1/2" cutter, and put in my 1/2" cutter, then find 000, and then hit run, and it would cut this groove. Okay, so hopefully this was kind of a cool example of going from an idea in our head to an actual part in our hand. And this was a real world example where I made something, but then I needed to modify it using our manufacturer workspace. So again, I hope you found this useful. If you liked it, thumbs up. If you didn't like it, thumbs down. Leave a comment, future topics that you'd like to see. I've been collecting all of those. I love all of the comments you guys have been sharing with us. I'm keeping track of all those. So if you want to see something, please share it with us, and we'll try and get it on an upcoming live stream. With that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.